Recording. Here we go. This month we're talking about the energy industry's newest buzzword, seemingly, blockchain. And it's our intent today to give everybody a 101 level intro into how it works and what applications it might have in the energy space. To give us a little bit of background in terms of why we decided to go with this month, as some of you may know, the Oregon Department of Energy's SB 334 group is putting together an accounting of renewable natural gas resources in Oregon, and that group was keenly interested in figuring out what tools are available, and this came up as a possibility. And I've been really pleased to see that the interest in this has extended beyond just that group, but also to our other utility and otherwise contacts. So very pleased to see that there's interest here, and very thankful for our friends at K&L Gates and PG&E for doing this. And on that note, we've got a trio of guests here today. We've got Buck Endeman and Dan Cohen in from K&L Gates. They both have developed quite an expertise in this space and are helping companies across the country utilize blockchain technology to streamline and track energy credit trading and other applications that I'm sure we will be learning about today. They're joined by Lydia Craft, who's representing Pacific Gas and Electric, where she serves as Principal Product Manager on the Grid Innovations and Integration team. PG&E is currently using this technology, I believe, to track low-carbon fuel credit trading, and we'll also look forward to hearing more about that and her firsthand experience in this space as well. So before we begin, let's go ahead and review the basics for how the webinars work. As always, we've set aside time for questions, and we strongly encourage you to ask them as they come up. Each of you will be muted throughout the presentation, so please use the text box to type your questions, and I will interject as needed to introduce those questions. I do my best to keep everybody muted, but if you guys could help me out and go to the audio section of that control panel and mute yourself, that would also be very helpful. For those of you who would like a PDF copy of this presentation, we are encouraging you to email Buck, who would be happy to pass that along to you, and we will get you his email address in a follow-up email so that you can do that. I know that some of you are also interested in seeing a review of this presentation, and we will be posting that to our YouTube channel. You can also send me an email at creiten@nwga.org if you're interested in accessing that link. I will do my best to make sure that that's available in the next couple of hours here. As some of you may know, we host webinars like this every month. We will be doing one more this summer, and we hope that you will be tuning in. We'll be sending out more information on that in the coming week or so. But also, we had a really wonderful time at our annual energy conference earlier this month. As we always do, we encourage you to look way ahead in your calendar and plan to join us next year for June 5th and 6th of 2019 at Skamania Lodge. I know that's a ways to look out, but we really enjoy it and hope that you'll be back. So, and finally, would like to introduce the Northwest Gas Association. For those of you who may not be familiar with us and what we do, we represent the 6 investor-owned gas utilities operating in the Pacific Northwest, along with the 3 large natural gas transmission lines. Our members are located in Oregon, Washington, Idaho, and British Columbia. As always, please visit our website at nwga.org for more information, or always feel free to send me an email. And with that, I'm going to pass things over to Buck, who will get things started.
Great. Thank you so much, Connor. We really appreciate it, the opportunity to speak with you guys. Let me make sure I can get this up on the screen. Connor, we good?
Yep, looks great.
Great. Just by way of introduction, I'm an environmental and energy regulatory lawyer, by heart. I've been doing it for about 10 years, so I'm not an intellectual property lawyer. I'm not necessarily a tech lawyer. But about 2 years ago, we had clients coming to us saying, hey, we hear about this new technology called blockchain, and we think it might have some applications for industry. So, what do you know about it, and what's it good for? And it gave us a really good opportunity to learn a little bit about the technology and how it can facilitate both environmental and energy goals. So that's the perspective that I bring when I talk about blockchain. So hopefully our introduction will be accessible and won't bore anyone with necessary or unnecessary technical details. You may have heard the securities law implications of Bitcoin and other types of cryptocurrencies. We know a little bit about that, but that's really not going to be the focus of this presentation. We have securities lawyers that have to deal with that. We are coming and bringing this presentation from an environmental and energy standpoint. So thanks so much for agreeing to participate. So just very generally, what we're going to cover today, Dan Cohen and myself talking a little bit about what blockchain is. What are the basic parameters of the technology? How is it different from Bitcoin? I'm going to talk a little bit about smart contracts and smart legal contracts. Once you start getting into energy use case applications, smart contracting becomes something that a lot of people like to talk about. And finally, I'll talk a little bit about how we see blockchain being used today in the energy industry. And then we're very fortunate to have Lydia Craft from PG&E on the phone. And she's one of the few utilities here in the United States who's actually gone ahead and worked on some blockchain applications to track LCFS credits. So that's a really interesting application, and I feel really fortunate to be able to talk to Lydia about how the utilities approaching these issues and how they're realizing the value of the technology. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Dan Cohen, who's going to talk to you a little bit about exactly what blockchain is in very easy, accessible terms. Take it away, Dan.
Hi, everyone. It's a pleasure to be with you. And as Buck said, we're going to keep this presentation focused on the basics of blockchain. So we're not going to wade in too much into the code behind blockchain or use any big jargon, but just give you a sense of what is a blockchain and how it works before Buck takes it away with some more advanced concepts and use cases. So a couple of quick opening points that may be helpful to know. Number one, blockchain is a technology software. So when you hear the phrase blockchain, there's no single universal blockchain, and it's not one tech program. Rather, it's a type of software that can be adapted for use cases. Number two, blockchain is not Bitcoin. I'm sure most, if not all of you, have heard of Bitcoin by now, and have heard that Bitcoin and blockchain go together. That's because Bitcoin was the first use of blockchain. But Bitcoin is just a digital currency that is run on a blockchain technology. You don't actually need to use what's called a cryptocurrency like Bitcoin to use blockchain, and blockchain can have a lot more applications like we'll talk about later today. And third and finally, blockchain is not just about money. It's not just about recording monetary transactions. It's really about storing, altering, and transferring information between parties. So as long as you have information that you can digitize, you can put it on a blockchain. So Buck, thank you. So what is blockchain technology? Here we've got a more comprehensive definition for you, but really kind of the key point to know is that blockchain technology is a means by which we connect computers in a peer-to-peer decentralized network that allows them to reach an agreement over what information that is shared on the network is true. So this means that data in a ledger can be updated, it can be verified and altered in real time, and you don't have to have a central moderator who we all trust proving the data is right. And Buck, we'll head to the next slide. So conceptually, what does that mean? In terms of payments, when you have two parties that want to exchange money, they generally have to use a third-party intermediary to do so. If you want to send money to your friend through PayPal, you both have to trust that PayPal will verify that one of you has sufficient money to send to the other. With blockchain, the network, not any individual institution or person that has to be trusted, verifies the transaction. So the benefit of blockchain is that it disintermediates. It creates a trustless environment in which computers can verify that information that's being shared on a ledger is true instead of having to rely on a third party. So let's break that down into the three core components of blockchains. All blockchains are peer-to-peer networks that use what's called a consensus mechanism, or simply just a rule by which all of the computers on the network can determine what information is true, and then that information is put onto a shared ledger or database that everyone on the network can access at any time, and the data is updated in real time. So we're not going to go into the more complex underlying issues of the code. We're not going to talk about cryptography too much. We're just going to keep this a little more general. So peer-to-peer network, what does that mean? Instead of having one centralized institution through which information is constantly filtered, every computer that has access to the underlying blockchain code is part of determining what information is true. Now, these computers are called nodes, and these nodes all communicate with one another. Now, what's important to know is that in a peer-to-peer network, you can have what's called an open network or a closed network. So going to the next slide, we can delve into that a bit more. Now, peer-to-peer does not mean that just anyone in the world can download your data and share information and help determine what information is accurate. Now, blockchains like the Bitcoin blockchain are public, meaning that anyone who has a computer can download the Bitcoin blockchain and then start running the code to help confirm transactions. Or in other words, they get to share information with the other nodes on the network and get to take part in proving what information is true. Alternatively, and what we see mostly in the industry, you have permission or private blockchains. This is where a group of individuals who know each other have access to the blockchain and no one else. So someone just off the street cannot download the blockchain code and start participating in the ledger. Point number two is the consensus mechanism. So how do all these computers know what information is true? Now, this can be very complicated, and we're not going to delve into the really code-heavy explanation and justification of how the computers know what is true is true. But what's important to know is that every computer or node that runs a blockchain has to confirm information by the same rules. These rules are preset, and any information that conforms to them is considered valid. That way, everyone who participates in the blockchain knows that the information is true, and there's not a concern that some of the computers are trying to game the system by putting false information on there. And this will lead to our third and final point. Once all of the computers on the blockchain network have confirmed that information passed along the blockchain is accurate according to the consensus mechanism, we have a shared ledger. Now, a shared ledger is exactly what it sounds like. It's a record of all the information that's been passed along the blockchain. It's open to everyone who has access to that blockchain. And importantly, it's immutable. So we know that the information that's recorded onto the blockchain can be trusted. Now, you can adopt the blockchain to different needs. So let's consider an example of liquefied natural gas shippers. Let's say you have a blockchain on which you want to record shipping information from LNG shippers. You want to know how much LNG is being shipped, where it's being shipped to, etc. We can devise a blockchain in which shippers can record onto the blockchain that exact information. Now, it's important for every shipper to be able to do so because they have the information that other parties are interested in looking at. But there may be certain individuals or entities we would want to have access to that information, but we wouldn't want them to be able to edit. So for example, if you want the Department of Energy to be able to see that information, you could adopt your blockchain to give them a read-only priority. That way, they can see the data in real time, but they can't manipulate it. So let's put this all together. In a very simple example, let's say you have Bob, who has a renewable energy credit that he wants to sell to Alice. So Bob will send a transaction to the network, informing the network that 1, he owns a REC, and 2, he would like to send it to Alice. This information is distributed to the network, which again, it's all of those computers we talked about that have downloaded the blockchain code. That information that he wants to send a rec to Alice will be put into what's called a block. A block is just a grouping of information or transactions that are sent all at the same time. Once that block is full, just like a piece of paper, once you've filled up all the lines on an accounting piece of paper, that block will be transmitted to the network. The network will then look at the information, apply the consensus mechanism, and determine whether or not the information in the block is accurate. And if it is, that information will be published to the network. Once it's published, everyone will be able to see in real time that Bob has now transferred to Alice a rec. And now Alice will have proof of ownership of that rec. Now this slide shows a little bit about the difference between public and private blockchains. Now, there are two key points to remember here is, one, who are the parties to the action and what are the details of that action? In a public blockchain, parties to the action are anonymous. This is pretty common with cryptocurrencies like Bitcoin. So individuals can send money to one another, but they don't know, other parties don't know who they're sending the information to. The details, however, of those transactions are transparent, meaning anyone can look at the blockchain and know that person A has sent money to person B, but they don't know who the individuals are. Conversely, you can have blockchains that have transparent parties. So similar to the LNG shippers blockchain analogy we talked about, everyone can know who those shippers are, what their identities are, but we can create privacy settings so we don't know what the information is. And this could be very useful in the business context where you want to know who's available to contract, but you don't want everyone on the blockchain network to know exactly the details of that contract. So why is all this significant? First and foremost, blockchains are essentially automated, which gives the benefit of having information being updated in real time, fast, in a manner where you don't have to put too much energy into ensuring that the information is validated. Second, and perhaps more importantly, blockchains create an immutable ledger that everyone has simultaneously. One of the biggest problems is sharing and proving that information is true, but with blockchain, everyone can know that the information they're seeing is the same information that the other participants in the network are seeing. So this enables parties to seamlessly track a product's life cycle and eliminates a lot of the waste in paperwork and duplication and third parties and intermediaries that are necessary. With blockchain, you can cut out all of those people and just share the information on the blockchain all at one time. And with that, Buck will explain what are smart contracts and how they use blockchain technology to automate exchanges.
All right, thanks so much, Dan. So smart contracts. What smart contracts generally are a set of computer code that sits alongside other information on a blockchain and can self-execute and can send some sort of digital asset or payment from party A to party B if certain conditions are met. And when you start reading about smart contracts, I guess the first thing you have to understand is that developers and software coders think about smart contracts much differently than lawyers do. From a development or a software programmer perspective, a smart contract is simply an if-then statement. You know, if the price of natural gas is $3, you know, then we will send you know, a particular volume of that gas to a buyer. And that is what people talk about when they talk about smart contracts and that type of if-then or those types of conditions being embedded on a blockchain. But there is a pretty wide spectrum of how smart contracts can be developed and implemented. We've all dealt with contracts before, and some of them are quite dense, and some of them have a lot of different conditions that aren't so easily distilled into if-then statements. But what blockchain can do is take some of the simpler aspects of contracts and make them automatically executable and automatically enforceable, and that's where we see most of the action today. They can sit on top of a blockchain, so the data is stored right there in the shared ledger, and everyone can look at the ledger and determine the conditions for when a smart contract could be met. And then the consensus mechanism, if the conditions are met, will execute the contract and have a transaction or measure of value sent from party A to party B. Now, what triggers these smart contracts? Well, they can either be triggered by information that is internal to the blockchain, or they can make use of Oracle. And Oracle is really nothing more than like a third-party data feed. So say you want to sell a renewable identification number, you might have an Oracle or some sort of data link to the Argus service that publishes an index of those. And if the price of, say, like a D3 RIN hits $10, that might be a signal to buy RINs or sell RINs, and that can be done through the use of a third-party index, but the transaction itself will be executed and recorded on that blockchain. So let's take a very easy example of when a smart contract makes sense. We have here a very simple PPA, and we look at the natural language. Upon exercise of the option by a buyer, the seller will deliver a megawatt quantity, and the option buyer will pay the strike price. So this is an example of something or a transaction that is pretty easy to encode, right? All you need is to define the relevant terms for an option. What's your strike price? Who's the buyer? Who's the seller? How much energy is going to be transferred when that strike price is hit? You have a little computer program, and all you have to do is really write a function code. If the message sender is the option buyer and that seller delivers the quantity of energy that was agreed upon, then the option buyer will send the payment to option seller. You wipe your hands and you walk away with the assurance that all of the distributed ledgers on each node have been updated to reflect the transfer value in that immutable ledger. And it sounds great, but before you go and try to commit all of your contracts to the blockchain, you have to understand some of the limitations of smart contracts, particularly when it comes to power and energy sales. A lot of times contracts will have different conditions or different provisions in them that excuse performance. So we'll take this natural language example here, where a party shall be excused from performance if prevented from carrying out its obligations because of an event or circumstances that's either not anticipated or not within the party's reasonable control. So this type of provision is typically agreed to at the time the parties strike a deal. And at that time, it's going to be very difficult to encode or anticipate each and every circumstance that could arise in the future that could excuse a party's performance. And that's why in a natural language contract, we have language like this built into the time, something that's not anticipated or not within someone's reasonable control. I mean, necessarily, these are going to be very circumstantial and circumstance-specific reasons why one party may or may not have to perform. And the difficulty with smart contracts is it's very difficult to encode these types of things into a smart contract. And it's very difficult to assign different triggering conditions for when performance is either warranted or will be excused. So that's why, in our experience, what we've seen for smart contracts or blockchain-enabled smart contracts is typically there's an overriding master agreement here, like a NASB or something else, and parties may commit certain aspects of what's normally understood as a confirmation to the blockchain. These sort of simplistic operations of contracts that can be automated and can be executed fairly simply, but it does not do away with contracts largely among themselves. Typically, in a legal sense, smart contracts are still governed by traditional legal principles the same way they've been looked at for hundreds of years. That is there offer? Is there acceptance? Are the terms of the deal sufficiently defined? Is there consideration? One other issue in terms of certainty is that you want to make sure that there's a meeting of the minds, not only between the parties, but between the people that draft the deal and the computer programmers that actually commit that deal to code. and make sure that's what is actually being agreed to is what is being committed to the smart contract and placed on the blockchain ledger. You can think of it as two parties negotiating a contract in English and then memorializing that contract in, say, German or French or Spanish or something else. The translation becomes very, very important to make sure that when certain conditions are met and something automatically executes, that the parties are getting the deal that they envisioned when they entered into their relationship. So are smart contracts legally binding in the U.S.? Well, by and large, yes, if they're done correctly. The normal contracting principles apply. And in fact, we've already seen a lot of contractual principles adapted to the digital age with shrink wrap contracts or click-through agreements or the privacy settings you agree to on Facebook. Generally, if you give someone an opportunity to read the terms and understand them and indicate some affirmative measure of consent, you're going to be okay, and your binding contract will result. There are some state initiatives out there which recognize smart contracts and blockchain technology, but for the most part, the state efforts don't really enable anything. They just simply say, we're not going to deny the validity of a smart contract or a record on a blockchain simply because it's on a distributed ledger technology. It just recognizes that the pace of technology is changing, and that's okay. And we're not going to invalidate things simply because they were put on a blockchain or a shared ledger. Okay, so that's the basics of blockchain, a little bit about smart contracts or how people might use blockchain to buy and sell goods or exchange information. So let's get into the energy industry applications. There are several out there. Some of them are more proof of concept than others, but we'll run through them really quick. And by and large, we see a lot more activity in Europe and overseas than we do in the United States, even though there are some interesting things going on domestically. My sense is that we see some early adoption in Europe because the energy regulatory scheme simply just isn't as complicated. You don't have a federal sort of level of regulation, then 50 states that are allowed to do their own thing. Where we've seen success stories overseas, you typically have the support of industry and the regulators, and that enables things to get done much faster. So first is tracking renewable attributes and emissions, tracking RECs and RINs to meet state renewable portfolio standards or federal renewable fuel standard goals. I'd say the most visible one that you've seen here is the Brooklyn microgrid. You might have heard of it. It's being run by LO3 in Brooklyn. And what they are doing is using a blockchain technology to not really buy and sell kilowatt hours, but to trade RECs back and forth among neighbors. We see LO3 rolling out a program down in Texas as well. Lydia, in a couple minutes, will tell you a little bit about PG&E and other efforts to use a blockchain-enabled system to better measure and verify credits for the low-carbon fuel standard. We see a transactive energy movement underway where you're using a blockchain technology to basically buy and sell energy among neighbors. Now, in the United States, it's very difficult to do in a regulated environment, but you are seeing that overseas, and you are seeing it in some behind-the-meter microgrid applications where people with excess energy can sell it to people who need that energy, and settlement is much faster and much easier to do. Electric vehicle charging is another very promising application for blockchain, simply because there's many different people out there that drive electric vehicles. There's many different types of charging stations and many types of tariffs and how those charging stations are regulated and how that electricity is bought and sold. What EV charging is doing in the blockchain space, and once again, a little bit more action in Europe, is having sort of one central platform where buyers of electricity for their cars can contract with sellers of electricity who own charging stations and settle out that information in much more real time. And sometimes it's settled in fiat currency, sometimes it's actually settled in tokens, which are sort of digital representations of value on the blockchain system. Wholesale energy and derivatives markets, this has been adopted by the financial industry more so than the energy industry, but the idea that you're going to be buying and selling certain commodities where you might have done it under an ISDA confirmation in the past, you typically will have some sort of master agreement, but a blockchain system will be able to be implemented somewhere below that master agreement to enable faster settlement and more trust among the parties, and potentially cut down collateral, cut down margin, and other sort of inefficiencies that we have right now. Smart energy infrastructure is another application. This is simply not necessarily of a transactive energy concept, but to have a set of instructions at various nodes around the grid. So if you have some sort of a grid emergency, not every decision has to be run through a central authority. You essentially have nodes out there on the edge of the grid that can change circuits or route power in a way that's much more efficient and less susceptible to fail if you have some cataclysmic event. So with that, I will turn it over to Lydia, and she will actually tell you what how PG&E is actually putting their money where their mouth is in terms of blockchain technology.
Thank you, Buck. My name is Lydia Craft. I work in the grid innovation team at PG&E, and I've been leading our blockchain R&D for about the past year and a half now. So PG&E has been looking at blockchain technology since about spring 2017. We started to look into it after doing some strategy work around some future potential business models and disruptors in the industry. And the timing worked out pretty well that we were going into a period of time where we were able to apply for some funding, some R&D funding through the California Public Utilities Commission through a program called EPIC. So last spring in May 2017, we formally proposed some funding for blockchain technology, and since then have been working to figure out kind of exactly what we want to do with that funding. So in that application process, we basically had to just put forth a simple one-pager talking about the technology that we wanted to test and the business need for that. And so what I have done for the past year has really tried to take that one-pager and develop it out into some specific use cases that we wanted to test. So we brought SMEs together kind of from across the organization, from all different lines of business, and did a bunch of different workshops, really ideating around use cases, business needs, process improvements where we thought blockchain technology could be really impactful. Ended up generating a list of 45 plus use cases. That's a living list that kind of keeps getting added to, and once we figure out a use case maybe isn't so great, get it deleted from that list, kind of ongoing as we speak. And we took those 45 use cases and we went through each of them and we vetted them to make sure a few things, did blockchain really make sense for those use cases? And I think a lot of times we found that on the surface, we saw a use case that we thought was really great, and we realized that maybe we just needed to put some more effort into a process improvement or improving data quality, or even just looking at a better centralized database or solution that would work well in some of these use cases. And so we vetted each of the use cases to make sure they really made sense. We looked at which ones were solving business needs and ones that really aligned with PG&E's strategic imperatives. And we down selected to 2 use cases that we will demonstrate with the funding once we receive approval from the Public Utilities Commission to run these 2 pilots. And those 2 use cases are, one is in materials traceability, and our other use case, which I'll go into detail in here in a minute, is this EV and certificates of origin use case. And so we're looking to understand how we can use blockchain technology, both from the standpoint of integrating electric vehicles into our grid, and also how we can use it potentially to improve some of the process around our low carbon fuel standard in California. And I'll jump into that now, Buck, if you want to go to the next slide. So I'll do kind of a brief primer on California's low carbon fuel standard program. It's administered by the California Air Resources Board, and basically any company that produces a transportation fuel that is above a certain emissions line has to purchase credits from a regulatory standpoint, and then anybody who's consuming fuels that are below that emissions line generate credits in this program, and those credits are generated based on the carbon intensity of the fuel that they're consuming. So if you're consuming a quote-unquote greener fuel, then you'll typically generate more credits. And that emissions line that says what is above and below the line goes down over time, and kind of forces a decrease in the overall transportation fuel emissions in the state. So PG&E saw an opportunity here that was a really great use case for blockchain technology. Currently, we calculate basically the amount of credits that our customers generate, both our customers who use electric vehicles and our customers who use natural gas vehicles and fill up at one of our 30-some compressed natural gas stations. From a natural gas standpoint, our customers have basically a special credit card that they use to fuel up, and so we're able to track pretty well the amount of fuel that's going into any CNG vehicle. But on the electric side, we really don't have as much of a great ability to track the amounts of credits that are being generated. We only have a couple of customers who have a separate meter for their electric vehicle at their home, and so we use that data to estimate the average kilowatt hours a day we think are fueling electric vehicles, and use that to kind of calculate how many credits we think are generated each quarter, and submit that to the Air Resources Board to generate credits on our customers' behalf, and then provide them with a one-time reimbursement for the purchase of their electric vehicle, which is the value of those credits that they're generating. In addition to kind of that baselining around the program, simultaneously the Air Resources Board is working with a diverse set of stakeholders to update the rules around this program for 2019. And they're really interested in getting a little bit more discreet about the type of the fuel mix going into the electric vehicle. Right now, for electric vehicles, there's only one carbon intensity that can be used in the calculation of the generation of credits, and that's an average fuel mix based on historic resource mix data on the electric grid. And what CARB's interested in doing is trying to better align credit generation with times of high renewables, whether it's on site where you're charging the electric vehicle, or if the grid has an excess of renewables at that time. And so what they're introducing is this idea of an incremental credit that you can get above and beyond that kind of base one-time credit that PG&E will provide to customers, that really takes into account the mix, the resource mix of the fuel at the time of charging. And so kind of with these two business needs, one just needing to have a more discrete, better way of understanding how many credits our customers are generating, and two, trying to understand aligning the resource mix with customer charging data. We saw a really great opportunity here to develop a demonstration using blockchain technology for the LCFS program. And so what we're trying to do here is a very simple demonstration. We're really trying to test some very simple kind of baseline hypotheses. And one is just that blockchain can provide a better way to generate LCFS credits and trace that chain of custody from generation through validation and the transaction and settlement in the program. And then kind of from a longer term view, looking at PG&E's strategic priorities, one thing that we are interested in is really pushing clean transportation from both the gas and electric standpoint. And so we're trying to use this to test our ability to apply blockchain to vehicles, to mobility, right? So can we use blockchain to enable transactions at the electric vehicle, looking at future use cases like demand response, smart charging, or vehicle to grid even way kind of down the line. So those are our two kind of simple goals. We're waiting on funding still from the commission, and so we've done a lot of work in scoping out this project. We are hoping to be able to run a demonstration around this project in 2019 with a goal of getting funding sometime within the next couple of months to the end of this year at some point. And Buck, if you go to one more slide further, I can kind of dive more deeply into what I mean when I say demonstration project. So if you look at this slide, you can see on the top, there's a kind of a breakdown of the two different types of credits that the ARB is proposing will go into effect in January 2019. The first is the base credit, which is just the typical credit that we currently provide to customers today whenever they purchase an electric vehicle. And the second is this incremental credit that takes into account the fuel mix that is charging the vehicle. You are only able to generate this incremental credit if you have basically a provable clean grid mix. And I think provable is a very important word because that means that the data must be there. One thing that blockchain is not going to do is going to improve data quality. And so we think that this is a really good opportunity to test blockchain because you basically have to come to the table with the data already in order to get these incremental credits. And then we're looking at using blockchain as a better way to track those transactions once we have that really good data. So the way that they're proposing that you can get incremental credits is through three different kind of provable ways. One, if you can just prove that you're on a 100% green tariff, then you're able to receive an incremental credit anytime you charge. Two, if you can prove you have on-site renewable generation, you can then also receive an incremental credit. And then three, and this is the one that we're really looking to test, is that if the grid resource mix is greater than that kind of grid average mix that they use to calculate the carbon intensity and calculate credits today, then you can get an incremental credit as well in that situation. And so we kind of broke this out in terms of how do we want to test this into really 4 steps. With the first step being, let's just bite off a piece that we can chew. I think there's a lot you can do with the low carbon fuel standard. There's kind of an ultimate vision where if this kind of could all be on the blockchain, you could generate credits, base credits, incremental credits, sell them to counterparties, settle all on the blockchain. But we said, let's just focus on one small piece of this for a minimum viable product. And so we said, let's look at customers who are at home, who are charging their vehicles, and specifically, let's test this ability to generate an incremental credit with an understanding that the grid mix is greater than the grid average mix. Second step that we're working on right now is really understanding the data flows, because applying blockchain technology it's really important to understand what data you need, when you need it, who's providing that data, and what needs to be seen by everybody on this blockchain and this single source of truth, and what maybe shouldn't be seen by everybody on the blockchain and should stay with the parties within their own kind of centralized databases. And so right now we're working with a couple of OEMs to understand how their telematics data works, what data they typically get whenever there's a charging session occurring, and trying to understand what is that data flow, and how could we potentially develop a smart contract that could help us to automatically generate credits. And so that third step then is, once we have these data flows determined, then we will work on developing a minimum viable product smart contract that, kind of like Buck talked to earlier, really just provides a couple of conditions that need to be met. And if those conditions are met based on some PG&E grid resource mix data and some OEM charging data, then it can automatically generate whatever number of incremental credits should be generated based on the CARB proposed 2019 rulemaking. Those first 3 steps are the ones that we're really focused on right now. Eventually, I think step 4 is once you've generated those credits and validated those credits, and you've determined who needs to validate those credits. Is it the ARB? Is it PG&E? Is it the OEM? Is it all of the above? There's a lot more you can do kind of across the life cycle of the credit, and that is eventually enabling those credits to be sold on a blockchain and having the transactions completed and settled on the blockchain. And I think that's something that we're looking at to prove out a little bit down the road once we've really proven that we can generate and validate these credits on the blockchain. So our next steps in this project, we're working on finalizing some agreements with some OEMs so that we can build out some minimal viable products to really prove out steps 1 through 3 here by fall 2018, looking to hopefully get funding from our commission to really develop out this pilot project in early 2019. And then we're continuing to talk to stakeholders in step 4. And so we're talking to people who have been our counterparties in the past, who we've sold these credits to get a really good, deep understanding of what the process is from the moment PG&E determines that we're going to sell credits into the market to the final step where we've come to an agreement with a counterparty, the transaction has occurred, the credits have been transferred, and we've settled that transaction, so that we can really understand what are the steps that would be necessary to kind of develop step 4 and beyond once we figure out steps 1 through 3. And then finally, we're really focused on the electric side of our business for this particular project, and that's mainly because our pilot funding from the commission will be coming from electric rates, and so therefore it has to be focused on the electric side of the business. But we've been keeping very closely in touch with our natural gas team, who does our natural gas low carbon fuel standard work, particularly as they're starting to look at incorporating more renewable natural gas. We've been working on a couple of dairy renewable natural gas pilots and are trying to really understand how we can capture that natural gas and kind of use it in the transportation sector so that we can generate those very valuable LCFS credits. And so we've kind of been bringing them along, looking to how we could potentially use this technology once we're successful here and apply it to some of our natural gas work as well. So our goal is to really have a complete pilot project that shows an end-to-end electric transaction by the end of 2019, with an eye towards expansion after that, kind of a phase 2 with potentially the gas side of the house, or even more OEMs or charging manufacturers on the electric side of the house. So looking forward to digging deeper in this project and coming back to tell you guys more in a couple of months.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Lydia. Well, that about does it for us. You know, we here at K&L Gates have a newsletter called the Blockchain Energizer. It comes out once every 2 weeks, and we basically summarize some of the developments at the intersection of blockchain and energy, so we can keep on top of what PG&E is doing and some of the other folks who are looking into the LCFS issues. Happy to answer any questions. Hope you guys found it useful, and I think Connor will be collecting questions and happy to stick around and answer them. And if anything else comes up, or if you think of anything after this webinar, here's our contact information on the slide, and we encourage you to email or call anytime.
Perfect. Thank you, Buck. Again, for anyone who's used the webinar before, you know the best way to ask a question, or the only way to ask a question, is to go to the chat box, which is on your GoToMeeting control panel, and type that out. Make sure that's addressed to the entire audience or to the organizers, and then I will introduce your question on your behalf. While we're waiting on a couple, I've got a couple of housekeeping items here. As most of you know, we do these webinars once a month. We've been very pleased to see the interest in this one today, and that just reminds us that we're really interested in hearing more about what types of presentations that you're interested in seeing. So I'm going to be sending out an email shortly after we get through here. That email is going to include a couple of things for you. One, Buck's email. If you're interested in getting a copy of this slide deck, please just send Buck an email. Or if you're just interested in talking more with him about this and the work that they're doing, you can contact him that way. Also, a link to the Northwest Gas Association's YouTube channel, which will give you access to this show as soon as we get that uploaded. That usually takes about an hour, but we'll get that done today. And also, we will be including a survey. And I just ask that you guys take 2 minutes. It's 3 or 4 questions, just to let us know a little bit about how you're feeling about the webinars. And also, if you're interested in a particular subject, please let us know, because we're looking at planning out the rest of our year in terms of webinars, and we really want to make sure these are topical for you. So please do that, and it shouldn't take you more than a couple of minutes. Now, back to the subject at hand here. We've got a few questions that have just come in. The first one, what are the main impediments to using blockchains that have come up? Russian hackers, pushback by auditors, what are we looking at there?
Hi, this is Buck. I'd say that the main impediment, at least from the on the energy side, right, and putting aside the securities issues with issuing tokens or coins, or trying to use a blockchain platform to crowdfund or raise money for something, because that's been difficult to get through the SEC. I'd say from an energy perspective, we've seen a lot of people promise this peer-to-peer energy trading without a great sense of how difficult it is to enter into a market that's been heavily regulated for a century or two, and it's very difficult to sell power to your neighbor without the buy-in of the utility or state regulator. I'd say that's the biggest impediment I've seen from the power side. Lydia, I know we've talked in the past about how PG&E has a lot of good ideas, but it's sometimes difficult as a regulated utility to put those ideas in action. Maybe you could share a few thoughts there.
Yeah, so I think kind of exactly like you just talked about, there's a lot of regulations around who can buy and sell electricity. And so while there's a lot of excitement, I think, in the space around the idea of peer-to-peer energy trading using blockchain, I think that we're really far from that from a regulatory standpoint. And so what we've tried to do is really understand, like, how can we test this technology on distributed energy resources so that we can kind of understand how it will work without running too much up into regulation. And so that's why the low carbon fuel standard worked out really well for us, because there's a business need there. There's current changing regulation that aligns with what we're trying to do with the technology. And we're really just right now trying to buy and sell digital credits that already exist. They're already a digital environmental attribute, versus some of these other use cases around peer-to-peer are getting closer to buying and selling actual kilowatt hours of electricity, which I think is a lot tougher and runs into a lot more regulation.
And also, I would say that I mentioned that the securities law issues with raising money. Now, if you're an established utility, part of the issue is that the process for getting regulatory approval or funding or rate basing can take some time that may not be consistent with the rapid pace of progress in technology.
Yeah, I mean, we applied for funding through our Public Utilities Commission last May to run a pilot project, and we're still waiting on it. And the amount that the industry has changed since last May, the amount that technology has evolved has been huge and pretty rapid. And so we're trying to kind of keep up with it outside of this funding and finding ways to kind of do things as a regulated utility, as a heavily regulated utility, to make sure that we're staying up to date on the progress in the industry while we're still waiting on the commission.
Great, thank you for that. We've got two more questions, and there's just enough time for those two, so that's perfect. The first of those two questions there is, what do you think the 5-year roadmap looks like, not just for the U.S., but also for India and China?
Sure. I mean, we've seen in terms of like tracking natural gas shipments, we've already seen some action in China in terms of Chinese LNG shippers using a blockchain system to essentially manage their supply chain. In Europe, we've seen companies actually, buy and sell natural gas and oil assets using blockchain. I frankly don't have a ton of insight into what India is doing. I'm not sure we've covered any Indian companies using blockchain in our Energizer. I do know that the Asian countries are pretty interested in it, China included, and because of the regulatory structure, it's frankly, it's just easier to roll out. You're not dealing with sort of slow-moving federal organization and then trying to navigate across a patchwork of 50 states. Regulatory approval is generally easier to get, and for certain state-owned companies that are rolling out blockchain platforms, we've seen that, and we've seen a greater willingness and a greater acceptance to trust the technology.
Excellent. We've got one more that just rolled in, so we'll see if we can fit everybody in. Let's see. Lydia, you mentioned the blockchain's limitation of data accuracy and the quality of the data. Can you expand on that point?
Yeah, definitely. So blockchains, like any other database, garbage data in, garbage data out. One really key aspect of a blockchain is that it's immutable, and so that makes it really important to have good data going in on the front end, because once you've confirmed a transaction on a blockchain, that is now there for all of time on everybody's records. And it becomes a lot harder to reverse something like that or to adjust something like that with an immutable database, immutable distributed database, as compared to a centralized database where you have one administrator who can go in and fix an error. And so I think it's really, really important to make sure the quality of data that you're using to determine what these transactions are is good on the front end, because otherwise you'll just have an immutable record of bad, poor transactions that's not really helping you to succeed in solving the business need that some of these different use cases are attempting to solve.
All right, last one here. Do you think that the specific blockchain smart contract implementations you describe in the energy space are at risk for hypothetical 51% attacks that have been a recurring concern in cryptocurrencies?
That's a good question. I don't know. Yes, I mean, there's always the risk that could happen. And it depends on who you're contracting with, whether you're going to have sort of a public or permissioned blockchain. Sometimes with permissioned blockchains, you just might have a handful of parties that have already dealt with each other, and there's already some level of trust among those parties, which is unlike, say, Bitcoin or another cryptocurrency where there's absolutely no trust among any of the parties, and that's the whole point of using blockchain to establish that trust. So if you have a sprawling decentralized network with a 51% attack, sure, you could have a lot of risk of getting wiped out. It remains to be seen how those energy trading applications will evolve. Now, if it's a small amount of or a small circle of trusted parties, I guess a 51% attack is a real thing to worry about, but you already have people that have been dealing with each other for now, and it would be pretty easy to identify who is behind that, or I would think it's pretty easy to identify who would be behind that 51% attack. If it's some like sprawling thing for like EV charging, yeah, I mean, I think theoretically the same types of risks could be attendant to those sort of open or permissionless blockchain networks. I don't know if Danny or Lydia has anything else to add to that.
Yeah, I'll just quickly add that I think that question, in my mind, ties a lot to the first question that we talked about around the main impediment. So it's a complete shift of mindset when you're looking at how to apply blockchain technology as a corporation or a company, because you have to cooperate a lot with third parties or other stakeholders in determining governance, in deciding what technology you want to use, deciding kind of the rules around smart contracts. And so there has to be a lot of trust, especially early on, because like right now we're trying to develop an MVP with like one or two other OEMs, and so a 51% attack would be incredibly simple. Like there's like probably going to be 2 to 3 nodes on our first MVP. And so there's a lot of kind of like early stage trust that I think you have to have, and you have to kind of shift that mindset in terms of working with, at some times even like your competitors, to try to develop this distributed transaction database basically. And there's a lot of, I think, risk kind of early on, and you're putting a lot of trust in making sure that you can move past that early stage where there's the opportunity for that 51% attack.
And if I'll just add one quick point, when we discuss consensus mechanisms, I think it's worth noting that different blockchains can use different rules by which they determine what information is true, and the details of those rules will have a big impact on whether malicious actors can conduct 51% attacks. So in the business context, if you're using a permission blockchain, it would be easier to have a consensus mechanism that would prevent fraudulent transactions than you would in a public permissionless blockchain. So it's worth knowing that you can customize a blockchain, customize a consensus mechanism to make it very expensive or functionally just difficult to impossible to have a 51% attack, provided certain parameters are set and you have a permission blockchain with known participants.
Great. Well, thank you guys. You guys finished right on time, so I appreciate that. And overall, a really terrific presentation, and I appreciate you guys taking the time to do it. For the rest of our audience, again, keep an eye out for an email from me in the next 2 to 3 minutes. Please do the survey. Really valuable to us to see what you guys have to say about this. And we'll look forward to seeing everybody again next month. Thanks again, guys, and we'll be talking again soon.
Our pleasure. Take care, folks.